National Guard Bureau. So in that responsibility, I'm responsible for essentially coordinating response and recovery to all domestic events that the National Guard is responding to around the nation. On behalf of General Joe Lengel and the 450,000 soldiers and airmen of the National Guard, and specifically in this case the Texas and Louisiana National Guard, I'd like to give you just a brief update on the National Guard's response to Hurricane Harvey. First off, our sympathy go out to the citizens of Texas and Louisiana potentially. This hurricane and the record flooding occurring in its aftermath, especially over the last 48 hours, have put a great strain on families in Texas, the individual citizens and our first responders, and our thoughts and prayers have to be with those that are victims of this incident in the state of Texas. We are also very proud of the Texas Guardsmen that have responded to this point. The soldiers and airmen have been working around the clock on behalf of the governor and the adjutant general in the state of Texas to alleviate the pain and suffering that have been experienced by the citizens in Houston and southwest Texas. I'd also like to emphasize up front that as we talk about National Guard response, the training and equipment the National Guard receives for our federal mission to fight the nation's wars also make it possible to be very good, especially as we rapidly respond to states' needs domestically. So that federal training becomes extremely important to our ability to rapidly respond, and some of the capabilities that we bring in support of civil authorities, that training we receive on the federal side allows us to apply those unique skill sets and capabilities, especially as you look at this in terms of rotary wing rescue, ground rescue, and things along those priorities. So it's extremely important that we recognize our Guardsmen have a dual purpose, not only to fight the nation's wars federally, but also to be able to respond on behalf of our governors and adjutants generals domestically in the homeland. The priorities for the Texas National Guard have remained the same over approximately the last 48 hours as they continue to support civil authorities in the state of Texas. Life-saving and sustainment, specifically search and rescue, both ground and air rescue, remain at the top of the list. Property protection, as we support not only security but presence missions around the state of Texas and specifically in the city of Houston in support of local, state, and federal law enforcement. And then as we continue down this, the Guardsmen also support shelter operations and route clearance operations in terms of starting towards the recovery phase once we start to get out of the response phase. There are currently 3,000 Texas Guardsmen on duty today. They'll be growing to approximately 4,000 over the next 24 hours. The governor of Texas has requested a military police battalion and Air National Guard security forces to assist local, state, and federal law enforcement, specifically in the heavily flooded areas. That big metropolitan area around Houston is where we think most of that assistance will be required. Secretary Mattis on Sunday approved the dual status commander in Texas, that is Brigadier General Pat Hamilton. He is in place in the dual status commander in command of both the National Guard forces in the state of Texas and any Title X or federal response forces that would be coming on that. So we do have unity of command and unity of effort underneath our dual status commander in the state of Texas at this time. Texas has already used over 500 vehicles, including 200 high-profile vehicles. Those are able to go through 2 and 3 feet of water, with more than 200 more ready, and we can posture additional high-profile vehicles from surrounding states to be able to come in at Texas' request upon need. There are currently 30 National Guard helicopters in the fight, approximately 30 National Guard helicopters, supporting not only airborne search and rescue efforts with hoist capacity, but also supporting medevac capacity where required. 24 more have been requested by the state of Texas through the emergency assistance compacts and will be en route to Texas today, and there's a potential that we could grow up to 100 helicopters as required by the state of Texas as we continue to respond to the historic flooding around the Houston area. These include both Air National Guard and Army National Guard rotary wing assets. In terms of rescues, and I want to be careful when I talk numbers in terms of rescues, obviously these are very fluid. As you all see, there's a great deal of rescues occurring around, by the minute. But those that the National Guard has either directly done or supported civil authorities for, those include over 3,500 personnel rescued. Most of those, as you see, have been by some type of boat, but these also include almost 300 hoist rescues, which, as you know, are very technically difficult in terms of hoisting people off roofs where they're inaccessible by any other method. There's also almost 300 animal rescues that have occurred as part of this. So it's not only the humans associated with it, but obviously the pets, and as we continue to alleviate the pain and suffering that the citizens of Texas are experiencing right now. I don't want to leave Louisiana out of the equation. As this storm continues to move across the Gulf again and potentially make what is being called a third landfall, Louisiana is posturing capability in advance of it. There are currently 400 soldiers and airmen in state active duty in the state of Louisiana. The state continues to pre-position equipment and materiel in advance of anticipated large flooding across especially the southwest portion of Louisiana there. The governor has not requested a dual status commander yet, but the Louisiana National Guard has pre-identified a dual status commander in the event that Title X forces look like they will be required in the state of Louisiana. We anticipate Louisiana will also request a dual status commander, as Texas has already done. I would like to emphasize before we go to questions that this will be a long-term effort. You know, usually when the Guard responds to hurricane-type events, normally we talk about that first 72 to 96 hours where life-saving and life-sustainment really takes place, and then we're really into a recovery effort. Due to the nature of this storm, as it spun across southwest Texas for days and dumped record or historic levels of rainfall across southwest Texas, our response to this hurricane has been very different than we've looked at before, and the planning associated with that had to be different because of the nature of it. So as you look at historic levels of rainfall, potentially up to 40 or 50 inches localized in certain areas there, and then sustained flooding over a period of multiple days or potentially weeks, as you talk response and recovery, our response is very sustained. In fact, it's phased in terms of how it comes in as population areas become isolated, and then they're in need of food, medical, water supplies, or lift by boat or rotary wing back out of that area. So the planning for this one has been very different. Normally, we plan response for that first 72 hours, 96 hours, weather passes, and then we're really into a recovery mode. We will be doing life-saving and life-sustaining efforts for a much longer period due to the nature of this storm. And then all the associated command and control structures as the Department of Defense looks at ramping up capability, because the demand signal is not right there immediate and then draws off during the recovery phase. This will be a sustained demand signal for DoD forces over time. So not only the National Guard, but the Title X forces underneath the dual status commander, this will be a unity of effort over a sustained period by the entire Department of Defense in support of civil authorities to ensure that we can continue to do all those life-saving and life-sustaining pieces, again, for periods of days, if not weeks, before we're into the recovery mode. So the planning associated with that, we've sent a large planning team down to assist Texas, in terms of the national capabilities, so that Texas is fully aware of everything that the Department of Defense has postured under U.S. NORTHCOM on the Title X side, and then all those additional capabilities that could come from surrounding states on the National Guard side to be able to add to that. Just to give you a round figure of numbers, we are looking at posturing just on the National Guard side an additional 20 to 30,000 soldiers and airmen that, if requested, could be brought in. And those capabilities include engineering capabilities, high-profile vehicles, additional rotary wing assets. But those will be to finish the response phase and then start into the recovery phase. Just like our first responders get tired and burn out, guardsmen will also get tired and burn out as we do this. So this has to be a phased approach, and Texas is planning for that phased approach, not only with their organic National Guard forces, but National Guard forces that could be brought in from surrounding states through emergency assistance compacts. So again, I would like to emphasize that our response to this hurricane has been different than anything we've experienced before, and we expect it to be much longer in terms of the response phase than what we would normally see during a hurricane, just due to the nature of the storm dumping historic, if not record amounts of rainfall in southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana. With that, I'll pause. Questions? Yes, sir.
Bob Burns with Associated Press. Question about the chain of command. You mentioned General Hamilton being the dual status commander for Texas. He reports to the governor, is that correct? And you mentioned that he would have command of federal forces, if that's the right term, in addition to the National Guard. Are there already active duty federal forces participating?
There are. I'll start with the last piece first, and then I'll back up into dual status commander, a brief explanation of that. United States Northern Command has postured well over 1,000 active personnel in support of it and their associated equipment. Obviously, Northern Command focused very much on SAR assets first that the state of Texas could employ as required, and Northcom, search and rescue, I'm sorry. And Northern Command has focused primarily on airborne search and rescue. Due to the nature of the storm, because weather restricted helicopter flying over the last 48 to 72 hours, the National Guard has done a great deal of ground rescue, not only with boats, but high-profile vehicles. So that's kind of where the Northern Command is in terms of it. Now, let me talk about the dual status commander real quickly.
Are those 1,000, though, are they actually pre-positioned, but are they actually involved right now?
Some of them are. Some of them are just pre-positioned, but there are federal forces involved in the response now.
Sorry, go ahead.
For dual status command, the dual status commander, hence by the name, has a responsibility to report through two channels. So the dual status commander provides the unity of command and unity of effort for the response and recovery for all DoD forces in support of civil authorities. He or she has the responsibility then to report on the federal side or Title X side to U.S. Northern Command, and on the National Guard side to the governor or the adjutant general of, in this case, Texas, so of their state. So there's a single dual status commander per state as we look at the response, who will then coordinate the command and control of all DoD forces in support of civil authorities. The dual status commander also has what we call a Title X deputy. So the dual status commander has a active duty soldier or airman that works directly for him or her that is also responsible primarily for the reporting on the federal side or Title X side of the House. Yes, ma'am.
Could you still go back over some of this? So does this dual status command that Abbott and the Secretary agreed to, does this now solve the issue of, do you have all the requests from the governor for federal Title X military assistance that you need? I understand it goes through FEMA and then it's farmed out to whoever can fill the request. But do you still need something from Governor Abbott in order to do more Title X assistance? Or do you have everything when did Governor Abbott say, I want Title X help?
Well, there's really, I'll try to make this as simple as I possibly can. There's a joint field office that's combined with the federal coordinating officer, who's the lead federal entity, the state coordinating officer, who represents the state of Texas, and then the defense coordinating officer. So that trio essentially generates the demand signal. Now, most of it, the demand usually comes from the state side. So the state coordinating officer will look at shortfalls amongst the civilian capability to be able to respond to a disaster. Once those shortfalls are identified, normally they look to DoD for the response. Usually inside the state, they'll look at their organic forces within the National Guard first. And then once shortfalls further are identified, the request for assistance then comes into the defense coordinating officer, into the joint staff here in the Pentagon for sourcing of not only active forces, but potentially Army Reserve or Air Force Reserve forces. So the entire weight of DoD, and Secretary Mattis, I think, has been very clear that if it's required from the Department of Defense, it will be provided. So the shorter answer to your question, though, is it depends on the governor and the state to ask for the assistance. So not only for National Guard forces, but for Title X or federal forces, it has to be identified. But normally there's some type of analysis done for where the civilian authorities no longer have the capacity for the response and recovery.
Right,
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I guess let's cut to the chase here. Are you getting timely requests from Governor Abbott? Are you getting everything you need from the state in order to have a rapid, active duty federal military response? Is this going fast enough? I mean, you see people in the water now for days.
Absolutely. In many cases,
Is the governor giving you what you need?
the governor asked for assistance, and everything we believe in the analysis we've done, that everything Governor Abbott has done in terms of asking for assistance, especially as you look at the weather impacts. So, when you look at search and rescue, we had a hard time of putting up rotary wing assets in terms of the search and rescue. So whether a phased approach and then literally civilian authorities recognizing the magnitude of the event in Texas and then asking for the assistance.
Has the magnitude been recognized fast enough?
That's debatable. I'd say that in many cases it has been, but anytime you look at a historic or record flooding like is occurring here, like I said, normally even our all hazards planning that we do at the state level in concert with the state wouldn't have accounted for this magnitude. So if you're looking at an event that only occurs every few hundred years, the planning that would have normally occurred for that probably wasn't here. So in many cases, the request for assistance, not only for the National Guard but federal forces, may not have been anticipated quick enough. But we're providing everything we can as quickly as the state asked for it, including pre-posturing, like I talked about. We think that based off the sustained, as we look at further planning, based off the duration of the response and recovery from this event, General Engel, under his own authority, is posturing up to 20 to 30,000 additional soldiers and airmen that could be used if Texas asked for them.
Can I follow up just one last question?
Yes, ma'am.
You said 20 to 30,000 Guard Reserve forces.
I'm specifically referencing National Guard, but if there's shortfalls on there, then they could be sourced with federal forces or Title X forces.
Well, that's exactly what I want to ask you. He's identified that he might need 20 to 30,000 National Guard forces over time for response and recovery. What are you identifying in terms of active duty U.S. military involvement? What do you think the top number may be on active duty involvement?
I know U.S. Northern Command is looking at, without going into the details, they have categories that they look at. They have prepared, they put all the forces that are readily available for the response and recovery in a prepared to deploy order. So all those Category 2 and Category 3 forces and their planning efforts have been put on a prepared to deploy order so that those units have been pre-identified and are ready to go. And then when Texas asked for them, they would be included in the overall Department of Defense response.
And how many ballpark is that?
Ma'am, I don't know that number off the top of my head. I know that they're postured to go to 2,000 over the next 24 to 48 hours. And that's just personnel. And obviously they'd have associated equipment with that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
General, I'm Paul Shinkman with U.S. News and World Report. Can you break down where the funding for all this is coming from? And do you have any estimates on how much it's cost so far? How much
I don't have an estimate on what it has cost so far. Most of the response, I'm talking National Guard response to date, has been in a state active duty status, meaning that the state bears the cost of the National Guardsmen being called into state active duty. So right now it is essentially a state bill, but with a presidential declaration and the associated Stafford Act with that, there will be a FEMA reimbursement to the state for the employment of the National Guard in the response and recovery. And normally FEMA will reimburse the state at a minimum of 75%, and depending on the event, sometimes higher. Does that answer the question?
And no sense yet on how much it has cost, how much it's going to cost?
No. We can do a rough accounting in terms of the personnel. So when you talk pay and allowance for personnel, we can kind of run those numbers relatively quickly. I don't have a roll-up of that yet. And then the use of the equipment is also reimbursed because the equipment is federally procured. So as the Guard utilizes the equipment, there's a reimbursement factor that goes with the equipment also.
And then separately, there have been some reports about how crowded the airspace has become, just given all of these search and rescue aircraft that are currently there and many more that may come. Can you talk about some of the effort that's been underway to prevent that from...
Absolutely. There has to be an airspace control order, something that gives some type of, and especially as the weather clears over the next 24 to 48 hours, the potential for rotary wing rescue, or some type of informational awareness type platforms, fixed wing platforms with sensors on them that are trying to do assessment of the damage or any other recovery efforts that need to take place. There's usually an airspace control order that we work through the state initially, but then it's also got to have full awareness of 1st Air Force or Air Force Northern, which is headquartered at Tyndall Air Force Base, especially in terms of the Rescue Coordination Center and how we actually deconflict the airspace there, because obviously we don't want to, we're trying to help the citizens of Texas and potentially Louisiana, so we have to be able to break up the airspace so that we're not actually, whether it's deconflicted by geographic grid or by altitude, but there needs to be some type, and that is in place. And it'll become more important as more helicopter assets come into the joint operating area over the next couple of days.
There have been some reports about the use of private drones causing personally owned drones.
Yeah, if I could, on behalf of the Department of Defense, private drones, as we are using military assets to respond in recovery and civilian assets to respond in recovery, the potential for drone impact is a big deal. And as much as possible, if we could keep civilian drones out of the crowded skies that are already crowded with people doing response and recovery efforts, that would certainly be helpful, because those present a hazard for our crews operating those helicopters in the region. Yes, ma'am.
Can you give us an idea of the scope of the area that you're having to do search and rescue, and how many homes you estimate still have residents that might need your assistance?
I don't have, in terms of square miles, I don't have those numbers. I'm sure that Texas is looking at that in terms of it, including the numbers of households. Obviously, it's easy to look at the Houston metropolitan area and talk about the 6 million or so people in the Houston metropolitan area. But there are many other areas that were impacted by the wind as the shore originally came ashore, with a great deal of devastation and then flooding across southeast Texas. And then as we head into the next 48 hours, flooding in southwest Louisiana. So it's hundreds of thousands of homes, and I just can't put a magnitude on the square mileage or number of homes. I'm sorry, I don't have that number. Yeah.
If we could you also just state your organization that you're with and your name, so that way.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Tara Cop Military Times. And also to go back to the currently 1,000 activated that are doing the SAR missions, what other Title 10 forces are on prepare to deploy status? And of the ones that are in this kind of first wave, how many total do you think are active and participating now?
I do know that Northern Command has, through Army North and San Antonio, over 1,000 personnel. That's all I have awareness of right now. I'm just trying to help the National Guard do their response side of it. But underneath the dual status commander, there needs to be unity of effort and unity of command. So everything that the U.S. Northern Command has postured for this response will be given to the dual status commander for them to be able to include into the overall effort. I hope that comes close to answering the question. I just don't have visibility on the total numbers of personnel and equipment that have either been already employed or are postured to be employed. Obviously, the active component has a great deal of capacity at Fort Hood. There's other DoD installations there, and even our reserve partners have capability that is postured in Texas that could be used for response if the governor and adjutant general needed, or the dual status commander.
How does the activation of National Guard assets now compare to the response to Katrina?
At the height of Katrina, there were approximately 50,000 guardsmen and a little over 20,000 active component forces. I anticipate, you hate to be predictive because this will depend on the magnitude of the storm. There will probably be a similar ratio, but to make an assumption that there won't be federal or Title 10 forces at all is an incorrect assumption. I'm sure Secretary Mattis would want to emphasize that this is the entire Department of Defense, including non-federalized National Guard and active forces required to help the citizens of southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana. Yes, sir.
Sir, yesterday there was the governor announced he was going to call up the entire Texas National Guard, and yet you were saying that, I guess, calling up, what, 4,000?
Up to 4,000 over the next 24 hours. So the Governor Abbott, as you look at available force, by the way, the Texas National Guard is about 19,000 soldiers and airmen. Governor Abbott specifically wanted to ensure that those, obviously the Department of Defense is engaged around the globe in terms of current operations. That includes the Texas National Guard. So those forces that are federally deployed or have just returned from employment or getting ready to deploy are unavailable to essentially to the governor for response, especially those that are already deployed. So as you look at those numbers, what Governor Abbott had available left with organic National Guard forces was approximately 12,000. That is the full weight that the Adjutant General in Texas has been authorized by the governor to bring on. Due to the nature of the storm, especially as they phase in capability, that could build up to that 10 or 12,000 point across the next few days. But forces that are already in the fight may need to be replaced. So I can't say that there'll be some day out there Sunday or Monday next week that there'll be 10,000 Texas Guardsmen. Some of them might already be replaced as Texas looks at a phased approach to the response and as they head into the recovery. Does that help with the numbers? Okay.
There's a lot of the capability, for example, bridge building companies are in the Army Reserve.
Yep.
Can you call on those assets?
Well, it would be basically the state of Texas would look at shortfalls and they'd put a request for assistance in, which would come into the Joint Staff here in the Pentagon. And it would be validated, so as the request came in, as the Department of Defense sources capability to be able to respond, it could be Army Reserve or Air Force Reserve or active forces. So the joint, in fact, sometimes it's a misnomer. You can actually put guardsmen on Title 10 in terms of domestic response. So the Department of Defense or the Joint Staff also has the choice to pick guard units to put on Title 10 to answer the request for assistance. Now, normally, since the Texas Guard is the one that's responding in this case, normally the Department of Defense is not going to pick a Texas Guard unit because they know they're being used in a non-federalized capacity. So I hope that comes close to answering it.
I'm sorry, last question. The 20,000 to 30,000 that may come from other states, what other states are you talking about?
And normally those are surrounding states, but some capability has already come from as far as New York and California. We have a specifically trained Air National Guard rescue units with Guardian Angel. It's really a weapon system. When you combine the H-860s with the pararescue personnel in the airplane, it's a specific capability that we knew we would need in this case due to the technical nature of the rescues. And those are in the Guard. They're only resident in New York, California, and Alaska. So we use C-17s to move those H-860s into the operating area because it was a capability that Texas would specifically need because those pararescue men, not only do we have the ability to hoist them out, we have the ability to provide initial life-saving or stabilization of patients as we do the movement, which is a unique capability that resides in the Department of Defense. Most civilian capability don't have that type capability. Yes, sir.
Hans Nichols with NBC. I got a clarification on the 300 helicopter rescues. Were those all of people? Because right after that you said 300 animals. So I just want to make sure it was 300
the
humans.
Animals, I assume the animals were all boat. So normally we will only hoist people. I don't want to exclude the ability to be able to hoist pets, but normally, my understanding, at least to this point, is those were all personnel hoist, and it's just under 300, but the numbers are changing by the minute, and that's just the National Guard. Obviously, our partners at the Coast Guard, other DOD entities, so I'm only able to report the National Guard piece. I think when you look at helicopter or rotary wing hoist rescues, the number is much larger than what I'm actually, okay. Yes, sir.
General Lucas Tomlinson, Fox News. Has there been any request for any naval assets, for example, the Comfort or Mercy, perhaps?
We understand that the Kearsarge could be en route to, I believe, the Norfolk. Don't quote me on the actual piece, but yes, naval assets are being looked at, postured. Obviously, it would take days for some of those naval assets to be able to get there, and I am not an expert on naval assets. But the Department of Defense, I think, is specifically looking at posturing naval capability that could be used to alleviate the pain and suffering in Southwest Texas.
What is the plan as we see these levees and dams start to break down, water overflowing? What is the plan to deal with that as these lakes and rivers continue to overflow?
Yeah, the initial piece of that belongs to the state or or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, those folks that specifically watch those things. We are normally, from literally from a National Guard planning standpoint, it's the after effect once the overtopping occurs. So as you look at those two dams, you know, the Addicks Dam, and I forgot the name of the one that starts with B, but on the west side of Houston, as they either overtop, and by the way, they're releasing, I think the Corps of Engineers reported they're releasing, you know, 8,000 gallons or 8,000 cubic yards per second or whatever the thing. That's a huge amount of water that they're having to release just to keep them from overtopping. And as it heads into those bayous there, obviously that water still flows through Houston. So it's really looking at the after effect of what that looks like. And again, I'm not an expert on dams, but it's the overall water effect that just historic, a record amount of rainfall has, you know, just overtopping of reservoirs is just one of the other issues, but it's still leading to that overall water issue in the Houston area. Yes, sir.
A follow-up question on that 20 to 30,000 estimate of additional possible National Guard forces being required. Is that your or the National Guard Bureau's estimate? Is that the governor's estimate?
No, sir. This is the governor has not yet requested these forces. What we are trying to do is anticipate, not only as a Department of Defense, but as a National Guard, anticipate Texas's needs. So some of those capabilities that follow-on capabilities, engineering capacity for route clearance, security personnel, military police, we are trying to anticipate all those needs, and we are posturing up to 20 to 30,000 underneath General Engel's authority. So essentially it's a training authority for these units to be able to plan to move.
So it's your organization's estimate of what might be needed, not the governor's estimate?
Yes, sir. Now we do this in concert with state Texas planners. So Texas is aware of what we're planning for and the capabilities that we're planning. Texas just hasn't asked for them yet. I hope that answers your question.
One other related question. So just to be, for comparison purposes, you mentioned the 3,000 Texas National Guard already involved, but you mentioned other states have contributed. So I'm unclear on the total number of Guard troops, as it were, currently involved in the effort. You know, the total. So
absolutely. I wish I could give you huge fidelity on that. You know, roughly, I'd say it's 3,500 today. I mean, as of this minute, but that would include forces that are already through emergency assistance compact being employed by the state of Texas. Yeah, and that number will grow along with the Texas Guardsmen, including federal forces too. That number will grow as more DoD personnel. You know, as the department looks at the full weight of effort that it can bring to alleviate the pain and suffering.
3,500 total, including Texas Guard.
Yes, and that's approximate number, and that will change significantly throughout the next 24 hours. Let's go to the back of the room. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Kim Dozier with the Daily Beast. When you hear Houston city officials talking about 450,000 plus people being displaced or affected, and the number of rescues ongoing and the need for them rising by the hour, I think the reason you're getting so many questions from us about why haven't extra military forces been called in by the state, it seems like people's lives are being put at risk because you're not flooding the zone with all of the available forces.
Yeah, as the weather clears and, you know, and a lot of this, when you look, the same flooding that's impacting these people and isolating them also prevents military assets and even civilian capability from being moved into support. So due to the widespread flooding, there are so many arteries that are literally impassable even by high-profile vehicles. So in many cases, it's the inability for military personnel to support the civil authorities or the first responders, but in many cases, the first responders can't get there. And then that's where we look at the unique capacity that the Department of Defense can bring, which is why we're so focused on rotary wing search and rescue right now. You know, and that includes Coast Guard assets and obviously the National Guard assets. But I'd say it's the combination of weather, you know, up to this point because of how long the storm has stayed over that southeast Texas area. And then the flooding that's created impassable arteries in terms of, not like I said, not only first responders, but of Guard forces to be able to get in. Look, as the state and the mayor of Houston, as they start to look at the full response and recovery, we are confident that more forces will be requested. As far as I'm aware to date, Texas has been given everything that they've been asked for from not only for National Guard, but from federal forces.
So just to follow up, you're saying that even if they asked for these federal forces and the federal forces were standing by, they almost couldn't get into the zone to help because it's...
Depending on the capability, yes. That could be one of the hampering factors. It's not the sole thing, and you know, it sometimes for the state to understand, the state emergency managers, the local emergency managers to understand the magnitude of what they're dealing with, they don't know what to ask for yet. Unfortunately, as you look at a lot of military assets, especially heavyweight military assets that might have to come long distances, we need that sometimes 48 to 72 hours lead time just to move it and get it there. Fixed wing and rotary wing's a little bit different, but I am sure that the governor of Texas has done everything he can do to ensure that pain and suffering is alleviated. And I can't speak on behalf of the state, but what I can say is that everything that has been asked for from the Department of Defense has been provided to the state of Texas. Now let's go all the way to the back.
Sir, if I could just dwell on this for one bit more, but you know, 20 to 30,000 forces sounds like such a huge scope. It's kind of essentially on the step, ready to go based on your analysis with contributions from the state thinking about it. So it sounds like from the cheap seats that you guys know there's a much greater need that's needed almost right now or yesterday, and you're still just kind of waiting for the state to kind of come around to figure it out. So, I mean, can you speak to,
Yeah,
I know that you've provided everything that you've been asked for, but the flip of the question is, has it been asked for?
I wouldn't characterize it as completely as waiting because like many of these capabilities, especially when you talk drill status guardsmen, it takes us 24 to 48 hours to alert and get a unit moving. So what we have done is we brought, for specific capabilities we think Texas may need, we've brought the planning elements on, we've alerted the unit so that when asked for, the unit will be ready to move. And if there's other capabilities that the dual status commander, as it's identified throughout the day on behalf of obviously the civil authorities within Texas, we can even start moving some of those assets even before the emergency assistant compact request comes in. I'm not sure I'm answering your question directly, but
You know, between what they're asking and what.
I know that on behalf of Secretary Mattis and General Engel, we are leaning as far forward as we possibly can to ensure that assets are postured, military assets are postured to support the needs of Texas and potentially Louisiana. Yes, sir.
Hi, General Mark Sellinger, Defense Daily. Are there any plans to deploy any high-end ISR assets to help find people who are stranded in various places like JSTARS, something like that?
I'm not aware of any high-end capability. There will be some fixed-wing assets and some rotary wing assets that are specifically configured for information awareness and assessment, IAA, and the terms for how we address it. So I anticipate, and especially as the weather clears here, you know, over the next 24 hours, a great deal of those assets will be used in the fight. But I am not aware of any more technical capabilities that would be applied to this problem set.
You said fixed wing, though?
RC-26s specifically. That's a National Guard asset. And those are normally just sensor balls that will be employed for medium altitude. And then obviously any of our rotary wing platforms that are configured with sensor balls could also be used for information awareness and assessment. We can go behind you, man. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Corey Dickstein with Stars and Stripes. I'm a little confused, so I just want to make sure I understand this right. So the 20 to 30,000 that have been alerted are in addition. They're not including the Texas Guardsmen.
That is not including that Governor Abbott talked about his up to 12,000 that Governor Abbott could employ from the Texas organic forces of the Texas National Guard. This is additional capability that the National Guard is looking at posturing should Texas need it.
The 12,000 National Guard, so beyond the 3,000 that are already working, they've been alerted that they could be working.
Are you talking specifically the Texas National Guard? The Adjutant General of the state of Texas, on behalf of his dual status commander, will alert those units as he needs to phase them into the fight. Like I said, I don't think, or phased into the response, I don't think that you'll ever see 12,000 Texas Guardsmen on any given one day. But it could reach that 8,000 to 10,000 range, depending on the needs of how they employ organic forces to the Texas National Guard.
I guess my question, I'm trying to understand why those Texas Guardmen wouldn't be called in first before these 20 to 30,000 that you guys are staging.
They would be. In many cases. In fact, normally the preference is that states, I'm sure Governor Abbott would love to respond with his own National Guard forces, but as you look at the magnitude and duration of the storm, we are just trying to anticipate additional needs on the behalf of Texas because either his forces will be employed and get tired and will need a phased approach to replace them, or they will be missing a capacity in the Texas Guard that exists elsewhere in the National Guard or perhaps Title X or federal forces. Yeah, right here.
Hi, Wes Morgan from Politico. You mentioned these Guardian Angel units from California and New York, I think you said.
Right.
Are there other parts of the military that can also do this kind of hoist operation stuff, and are they already doing it? I mean,
absolutely. The active component of the Air Force has the same capacity. It exists both in the not only the Guard, but the Air Force Reserves and the Air Force. So as you talk H-860s with Guardian Angel or the pararescue folks, in fact, that same capacity has been pre-positioned for Moody Air Force Base in terms of being able to respond, and I'm just not aware if they've been employed yet or not.
And has the Air Guard contingent been called on at all, or no?
Not to my knowledge. They remain pretty busy in the summertime in Alaska doing rescues of their own. They're called on almost daily just in the state of Alaska. Yes, ma'am.
I know you didn't have at the top of your head which other states are involved. Can we take that for the record so we can find out exactly how many states are involved in this rescue effort? And then also, do you have any tips after 3,500 rescues? Should a citizen from Louisiana in the coming hours or Houston come under the need for assistance and rescue, what should they do? What advice do you have for them?
Well, we always try to echo what civil authorities, either in Houston, so we will always echo their messages in terms of that. But you know, it's obviously if you're going to travel and you're going to travel through water, turn around. It's obviously not worth going through. The rescues, it's get to the roof, not the attic. You know, we can see you when you're on the roof, and there's potential to be trapped in your attic. So, and again, these are just messaging, the same thing the civil authorities, specifically in Houston, have been doing. And then call 911. And we've been told that if you call 911, it may not be answered right away, but stay on the line, and eventually they're going to get to you. And then that information is then passed on to the Rescue Coordination Center, the National Guard, and even the Coast Guard. You know, the Coast Guard has actually been taking, I believe, some of those 911 calls when it backs up in the civilian system to ensure that everybody that needs some form of rescue is able to get through a 911 system to alert civil authorities that they need help.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions, please.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that the Guard has rescued 3,500 people. The Coast Guard has reported 3,600 people. So altogether, are we looking at 7,000 rescues, or is this one?
Look, I think especially as you look, Texans helping Texans, and when you look at the magnitude of the number of kayaks and boats that have been out in some of these flooded areas, it's literally getting people to the point of high ground or a collection point where they can then be moved to a shelter. In many cases, the Guard is supporting not only the movement to the shelters, but the shelter operations. The Department of Defense can probably numerically, I mean, the number I have the most confidence in is the number when we do a hoist. When we actually pluck people off of rooftops that are in need, I have pretty high confidence in those numbers. But when you talk about the number of people that are being moved by boats, at best, the Department of Defense will be going to be a round number where a Department of Defense asset has been used in support of civil authorities to move those people. But I'd say, you know, when you look at especially the population of the Houston metropolitan area, I'm not sure we can fathom the number of people. So to actually use a number, I am hesitant to do it. I can say that in the National Guard, using assets that we have, primarily boat assets, that's the number that we have been reported to by the state of Texas. So I'm just echoing a number that Texas provided for us. But when you look at the magnitude, especially the number of first responders with boats and the number of just citizens helping citizens, I'm not sure we can count the number of what you would really call rescues. The technical rescues, those where we're doing hoist capacity, I have relatively high confidence in the numbers. Does that come close? Yes, sir.
General Ryan Brown, CNN. Thank you for doing this. Do you have confidence that the 20 to 30,000 troops that are being postured in pre-position will be called in by state authorities in the near term?
I can't tell you that for sure. It's going to depend on the magnitude and how long the storm lasts. And then literally what the first responders in the state of Texas needs. I can't predict to you because even in the Houston area, some of our first responders were victims themselves. So as you look at additional capacity to the civilian authorities within even the Houston area, I can't tell you how many of those first responders were unable to get to work because they were also victims. And then at what point, as the Department of Defense comes in to help civilian authorities, at what point we'll need to replace our own forces. So these are capabilities that are being postured in the event that they're needed. We just wanted to ensure that there was no delay when the governor in the state of Texas asked for a capability, the department could be able to provide it, and that the National Guard could provide those capabilities. And I'm sure that Governor Abbott and the Adjutant General in Texas, Major General John Nichols, they're looking at the exact same thing for their organic forces, and ensure that they're phased in and that they're looking at not only the health and welfare of their own soldiers and airmen, but at what point do I need to actually look at a phased approach to how I do the response and recovery.
General, can you talk about the contribution of the Cajun Navy or Houston residents in providing local search and rescue? Can you talk about that contribution?
I can't. I'm sorry. I'm only aware of open source media reporting on it, so I really can't talk to any of the effects of that.
We need to keep on schedule, sir. And if you have any final comments?
Hey, thank you all so much. I know that on behalf of General Engel and the Texas National Guard and the Louisiana National Guard, we are very focused. General Engel has said this is our number one priority, not only for our staff here in the Pentagon in Washington. Normally, we are a strategic staff in support of our boss, who's a member of the Joint Chiefs, but in this case, we become very operational in terms of how we provide and plan to be able to support our states that are in need out there. In this case, as the Texas and Louisiana Guard comes in support of their citizens, General Engel just wants to ensure that the full weight of the National Guard, and I'm sure Secretary Mattis would do the same for the Department of Defense, that every military asset that can assist our civil authorities in terms of the response and recovery from Hurricane Harvey is put in place. Thank you all so much.